Thank you for joining us on this ceasefire moment. Grace versus law. There is contention between grace versus law within the Christian community. Over the next several weeks, we will take a look at grace and law and see what Scripture has to say about it. We're going to start out in the book of Matthew and then some of Matthew 5, then review the laws that Jesus talks about there, and then come back to and go through Matthew's chapters 5 through 9 of a long teaching by Jesus. And as his followers, it might be a good idea to find out what he said. It's interesting to call oneself a Christian or Christ follower, yet be able to quote Paul more than Jesus or any of his disciples. Don't forget, Paul never met Jesus. The disciples spent almost every moment with him while he was walking on earth. No matter who we are listening to, John, Peter, Paul, or anyone from today, we should start with Jesus. Jesus is the cornerstone. He is the foundation. Jesus' words were captured by those who traveled and lived with him, and people who had direct contact with those who traveled and lived with him. If any one of them doesn't line up with the others, it has to be an interpretation issue, and the interpretation needs to be reevaluated. We find one of those situations here in Matthew, as some of what is taught here is interpreted in a variety of ways. It isn't my intent to tell anyone how to interpret, just to give the cold hard fact and some background, and at the very least get you interested in figuring out an interpretation on your own. One of the first steps to any study is to get some information surrounding the situation. Who wrote what we're reading? Who is it written to? Who's talking? And who are they talking to? Where are they? Etc. Let's look at some of this in regard to Matthew. The early church fathers were unanimous on the writer being Matthew, the disciple. Later scholars questioned whether Matthew was the writer because the book quotes Mark. The general consensus is that it was written during the early church time frame, possibly around 50 to 60 AD, and a few will date it as late as 110 AD. Most timelines put the ascension of Jesus at about 30 AD. Matthew would have been most likely written between 20 and 30 years later. Some say Matthew was written in Greek. There aren't any surviving Hebrew manuscripts, and it is believed that he used Mark's writing as a source because of the direct parallels. Some say it was written in Hebrew. The earliest witness is a 2nd century bishop named Papias, who wrote that Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language. Later in the 2nd century, another writer wrote that Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. Generally, it is believed to be written to Jews who had converted to Christianity. This concludes this episode of this Ceasefire Moment. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you learned something.